Year 4 and welcome to the second part of our chapter, The Land Where the Sun Goes at Night. So if you remember our reading from yesterday, the men had finally reached the fantastic land. There was lots of resources like animals, water, the plants were just growing immediately. But unfortunately there were some strange, horrible creatures and things there as well. And the men ran away from the creatures up the mountainside, which actually then turned out to be a volcano. And we finished that part of the chapter with Thorkild saying that he had seen something he never thought he would see again and walking back up towards the volcano into the flames. So we're now starting reading from the top of page 160. What was it? They asked Erik. But Erik only shook his head and replied, "Wait, we shall soon see for ourselves." Then the smoke began to lift, and as it did so, they all gasped. For there stood Thorkild at the very summit of the mountain. He was blackened from head to toe, and his eyes were white, as if the heat of the flame had seared them of sight, and they knew that he was blind. Yet he was smiling, and in his hand he held a sword that was glowing like all the stars in heaven, and each and every one of the companions gasped, for they recognised it at once. "The Star Sword!" cried Thorkild. "And I thought I should never see it nor hold it in my hands again, but now I can feel its power coursing through my arms and my whole body. It is the Star Sword. My hands know it, and in my blindness I see it as bright and as shining as that day when it slew the dog fighters on that beach so far away and so long ago." "It is the Star Sword," cried Erik, "and it saved us then, and it shall save us now, for I believe there is no enemy in this world that can withstand the magic blade." And even as he was speaking, they heard a roar, and they looked down and saw a myriad of torches on the mountainside below them, burning in the dark and swarming up the scree towards them. "Look," said Erik, "where there were 30 or 40 of them before, it seems there are now 300, 400, maybe 1,000. See how their torches fill up the mountainside." "Let us hope the Star Sword has not lost its powers," murmured Erik's men, "for if it has, we are dead men." "It has its powers still," cried Thorkild, and he stood there on the mountain top with the Star Sword held high above his head. "But something is wrong, something is different." And the Star Sword shook and glowed brighter and brighter until it was a white light, shining as if it were the sun itself, and none could look at it but had to turn their eyes away. Then below them they heard the roaring cease, and they looked down and saw, by the light of the Star Sword, the monstrous creatures, with their heads in their chests, armed with mighty axes, spears, and swords as long as the mast of Golden Dragon herself. But they were standing bewildered, dazzled by the light of the Star Sword. Then a great clattering filled the air as the creatures let their weapons drop to the ground. And then the ground shook as the monsters themselves fell upon their faces, covering the eyes in their chests, blinded by the Star Sword. "Now the Star Sword will slay our enemies," cried Erik's men, "now that they are disarmed and disabled." But Thorkild gave a cry of pain. "It is different," he shouted. "The Star Sword is burning in my hands." But he held on to it, and the Star Sword began to vibrate, and an unearthly note rose up from it that began to change as the sword quivered faster, and then slower, and then faster again. And as it did so, note followed note, until they began to form a slow, haunting melody that enfolded the mountainside like a warm cloud. "I cannot hold it much longer," cried Thorkild, "for it burns my hands." "Quick," said Erik, "we must take our chance." "But we dare not move until the Star Sword has slain each and every one of those terrible creatures," cried his men. But Thorkild gave a great cry. "Run!" he yelled. "Run before the Star Sword slays each and every one of us." And at that, Erik set off down the mountainside towards the prostrate creatures. And although his men were filled with fear at the thought of running into the very midst of such an enemy, they saw nothing else for it, and so they followed. Only Sven the Strong hung back. "Run!" cried Thorkild. "I cannot hold the sword much longer." But Sven the Strong did not run. Instead, he bent and lifted the blind Thorkild onto his shoulders, and then made his way swiftly after the others, the Star Sword still singing its strange song as Thorkild held it high above his head. Down they went towards the gigantic monsters, and without hesitating, Erik began to pick his way through them, there where they lay in their hundreds, and not once moved nor raised a hand to stop him nor any of his men as long as Thorkild held the Star Sword above his head. And in that picture on the next page, you can see the men walking over their bodies, I think. And now the song the Star Sword sang seemed to take on words, strange, outlandish words that neither Erik nor any of his men could understand. Hurry, cried Thorkild, I cannot hold this fire in my hand any longer. And Sven the Strong redoubled his efforts, threading his way through the fallen giants. Several times he stumbled and almost fell beneath his load, but he managed to keep going until, just as they had reached the last of the prostrate monsters, Thorkild gave a cry and let go of the Star Sword, whereupon it flew out of his hand, and the vibration and the music stopped abruptly. And the moment it did so, the giant creatures stirred, and one by one they began to raise themselves up and started to gaze around by the light of the Star Sword as it hung in the air above them. For a moment it burnt even brighter than the sun, but then it began to flicker and fade until it became but a glowing ember that shot across the sky like a shooting star and disappeared over the distant horizon. Erik and his men made their way after it as swiftly as ever they could, and behind them they heard the half-blinded giants blundering about in the darkness. And so, before the creatures could stop them, the comrades regained their ship Golden Dragon and had soon put a mile of water between themselves and the land where the sun goes at night. So we're going to stop there for today, and our lesson tomorrow will be looking at the last few pages of that chapter. So go and have a go at the questions and the task, and I'll see you tomorrow. Bye-bye.